Hey everyone, welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
And today, Paul, a practice in action episode that's kind of going to blend a little developmental psychology, developmental psychopathology, and maybe parenting.
Yeah, so a lot to cover. And, I think it's something that, I should introduce the topic. So today we're talking about temperament and, so something that I think is commonly covered in a lot of those, developmental courses, and something that can be really helpful if we can kind of spend some time familiarizing ourselves and trying to make it applicable.
Yeah. I think it's, it's interesting. I mean, so to give maybe the audience a little kind of a background on it, the reason we started, I wanted to really kind of do this topic was, really following developmental psychopathology research that's out there that I think many of us probably in the field, and I'm sure most parents aren't picking up journals about developmental psychopathology, but such great research that's happening around understanding how temperament might influence later difficulties. So things like, neurodiversities like ADHD and autism, or even things like anxiety and depression, that there are some signs that we can kind of see in early ages that I don't want to say are necessarily a predictor, but maybe present some risk factors or some red flags to some extent for us to monitor, and maybe respond differently to help build coping skills for kids. I think anybody that's in the field has had a developmental psychology class, and probably are familiar with Alexander Thomas and Stella Chess's work on temperament. And essentially that, there's these 9 traits that develop kind of our behavioral and emotional response style. So that's essentially what it is. But now we're learning, again, kind of more about how do we use that and understand kids, where maybe as professionals, we can consult better with parents to help them tailor their parenting style for the benefit of the child in a much more supportive way, but also in a way to again, kind of help that development of coping for areas that might be more difficult.
And, I think one of the initial reactions that it's not uncommon is that, with temperament really being recognized as a bit more of like a biological or genetic component, this idea of like, oh, well, it's just a part of who the child is. And, we were talking earlier about this like kind of view of it, of these different, traits as being a spectrum and kind of identifying, where the child might fall on that spectrum. That doesn't mean, through some of these interventions and through, creating maybe some, almost intentional opportunities, we can create more adaptability and more resilience. And I don't think resilience is ever a bad thing to help cultivate in our children. Yeah,
I agree. And I think that, when I started reading a lot of the research, I see my own parenting traps that I got into, where sometimes our kids do respond in a certain way because of this temperament. And maybe we become accommodating to that, which I don't necessarily, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but maybe we overly accommodate to it where we don't kind of stretch their skills along that spectrum. And, I think that knowing this information, it gives us a chance to do both. I think that there's no right or wrong. There's kind of like, how do we support and accommodate at times, but how do we also continually stretch our child's skills that maybe their temperament isn't at a point where it's so extreme over time. I think it's a kind of an interesting topic that I think, again, I took developmental psychology twice throughout my education. I don't know that I think about it all the time.
No, and certainly the areas in which I do think about it, like I don't think it necessarily comes up when we're talking about, well, it does with parenting styles, but kind of in more specific like attachment ways rather than temperament. So I'm happy to take this opportunity.
Yeah. So I think maybe let's kind of go through and talk about these temperament traits. So just again, for the audience purpose, this Thomas and Chess research that, again, maybe you're familiar with, really identified these 9 traits that we all have. We all have these 9 traits, but within them, there are these ranges of how we may respond to each of those traits. So maybe let's talk about each one, and then ask twofold, maybe how we can parent, but also what are some of the risks that we see. So you want to start with the first one, Paul?
Yeah. So the first one we have here is activity. And so really kind of thinking of that as kind of the general energy level, or even just amount of like physical movement that our child will typically display. And kind of that kind of noted range is kind of on the upper end, thinking of that as, our more energetic children, and that lower end range being more of our like more sedentary. Again, thinking about clients I work with, I can certainly see different traits coming out. The ones who have to keep things contained, or else we're going to be disrupting the sessions on either end because things are going flying. Or the ones that we're slouching down and just kind of like that level of almost interactivity. And so I know a lot of this is focusing even on like younger childhood, but just again, as those traits kind of manifest and are presented as they develop.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's this is something that we're going to see early in childhood. And I think when we think about, this idea of activity, we think of hyperactivity, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing that kind of pops out the most. But there are kids that are just more energetic. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily a symptom of something. It's just kind of that range. So, I mean, I think, as a parent, we kind of think like balancing, like, so what do we think of when we're, if we're working with parents and they say, gosh, my kid has all this energy, this activity level, maybe they're on that energetic side, it's making sure things like we have movement breaks for kids, that we, make sure that we again, kind of support that in some ways. Like, it's great. I mean, there's nothing better than watching young kids run around and be active. I think that's a great thing. But there also has to be a balance to that. And I think also those things where, there are some times we have to have them sit and concentrate for a little bit of time. And maybe at a young age, that might only be 2 or 3 minutes. But encouraging parents where that we do have that time for them to do something calming. And that's not always easy. So I don't want it to sound like, we're going to say, oh, just set them down and give them crayons and they're going to color. But, it might be something being creative where maybe we have a table outside that we put sand on and let the kids build something in the sand, that there's still some movement, but there's still that idea that they're sitting for a certain moment of time. So trying to get that balance, like, with everything, as kids get older, what are we going to expect them to do? They're going to be in a classroom.
Yeah.
Some kids, we can do all those interventions and they're still going to be very energetic.
Up out of their seat. Yeah. And we're, standing at the,
yeah, they're going to still do it. But again, it's not trying to eliminate it in them. It's trying to give them more tolerance to be able to sit for longer periods of time. I encourage parents that come in with young kids, start with 2 minutes. And if they sit for 2 minutes and do something, that's great. Maybe you're reading a book to them, whatever it is, and do that for a while and try to get to 2.5 minutes. And we're just going to kind of gradually build their tolerance to sitting.
And along those lines, I think not only the duration, but the intensity. And so what's the level of intensity of physical movement? And if we can even reduce that, going from this full body need for movement versus can we focus that movement on one area? And but I remember reading an article, and it was actually, I was trying to do some research to help advocate for one of my clients where they really wanted to be able to use a fidget because they'd had experience growing up with being able to use a fidget as a means of just some physical activity and physical movement that helped to keep them also in a single area. And so I'm like, hey, let's take a look. And so, I think even in that, that I think our really young kids fidgets can maybe be more of a projectile than a tool, but being able to introduce some of these things as tools. I'm thinking of the balls that are used as seats. And so, okay, the intensity, we're now not standing, but we're rolling around, and then the wobble seats. And then, eventually can we transfer that to, maybe it's more like, kind of some of that like restless leg movement, or
right.
even some of the other more functional, like, if it's fidget spinners or things like that, something to manipulate and giving some of that in, physical release without there having to be the full body movement.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways. And, when I talk with parents, I oftentimes don't use terms like energetic and sedentary, so I always say, our kids should be a balance of being movers and thinkers. Like that's really what we're trying to do. And at times we do want them to just be able to minimize the movement, and again, maybe have some outlet, but try to find some functional ways to do that. And at times let them move like crazy.
Absolutely.
And let them and that's okay too. Like we really want to see kids be able to have that balance. And some they're going to fall right in the middle, and others they may, lean one way or the other, and that's okay. It's just trying to build that balance between the two. So the second one, I guess maybe we're going to go through is this idea of regularity.
Yeah.
Or sometimes I think the name I've always also heard is rhythmicity. I think that's what it is. That's the right word. Yeah. So that's, so essentially that it is this kind of piece that's biological and around biological functions, a lot of times around things like appetite and sleep. So, these are those children that have specific patterns that they get into. And, there's kind of those kind of two spectrums of that range, predictability on one side and variability on the other. And so, we have these kids that need regular patterns. They thrive on routine. I call them clockwork kids. And then on the other end, kids that are really unpredictable in their behaviors, which I refer to as free flow kids. So, both the need for structure or complete unstructured. And
again, developing a tolerance for, some of that opposing side. And so, for our kids that are, lean more into that predictable, we're not always maybe going to be able to accommodate bathroom breaks at the same time or meals at the same time, or even, as much as parents, we want to help support, bedtime routines and structure. Sometimes that's not going to happen. And so being able to have some of that, variability on the other side of that, though, for our children that are, very irregular, or, the free flow, working to kind of introduce, again, maybe even a range. And so if it's not a specific time, can we work to create like a greater range in terms of like in paring it down until there's an ability to manage some sort of pattern or routine to help, promote stability for them in these areas.
Yeah. And I find this one really interesting because there is such a biological aspect here, right?
Yeah.
It's from a parenting standpoint, there are some real benefits to moving to a higher level of regularity, where especially around sleep and eating, we know that we know from research, right? It's kids who have good sleep routines, have healthier lifestyles. There's long-term benefits to it. So starting kids really young, going to bed at a specific time, waking up at the same time, all of those things have really good benefits. And even with eating, getting kids on, we're eating breakfast, we're eating lunch, we have maybe specific snack times. Those are all really good things. But I think that a lot of times what I see is sometimes parents don't throw curveballs enough at their kids with it. I mean, and I remember like when my kids were little, I mean, they're adults now, every once in a while we would just do something a little later in the night. Like we'd break that routine, and they were cranky, they got thrown off, but it gave us a little way to help them adapt to it. And, it's interesting. My kids now, even as adults, they have pretty steady sleep routines, but if they need to stay up, they're also not, out of control about it. They're able to manage it.
And, if we're thinking about like this, even like, I think even driving, if I'm driving a long distance and from the backseat, I'm hungry. Right? Like, hey, like depending on where we're at, are we stopping and accommodating to that in this moment? Or is it like, hey, can you wait 20, 30 minutes for us to get home when we already have like food? And so, in that sense, like, can we work to create some more flexibility? On the other end, though, hey, if we're working to build patterns, maybe we are working to like, stopping where we can to get, because, hey, we're acknowledging that there's that hunger. We're working to then have it within this routine, or, hey, this is your opportunity. If you want a snack, now's the time. If not, then we're waiting till the next time. So yeah, like offering some of those kind of, variants in both. And I think that's a really valuable skill.
And if there are different difficulties balancing that variance, helping kids build executive function skills around it. So I have many patients I see that their hunger level truly is the Snickers commercial, right? It's they get hangry, right? And it's just part of who they are. And so for them, those are the kids, at least, in teenage years, where parents have got them to a point of saying, hey, like I need to carry a protein bar with me. Like I need to have that. And because if I get that way and I need that regularity, I've thought in advance of it and I've prepared. And that's great. So sometimes maybe we're not the people that can not eat for a whole afternoon. That's okay. But it's being aware of it and being able to, again, kind of accommodate that can be helpful.
And, kind of going into this next area or this next trait is labeled as initial reaction. And I think I've also heard it as kind of like the approach withdrawal kind of perspective. And it's just kind of, our children's general response and reactions to new people and situations. And, again, kind of defining this range on the upper end, being more open, on the lower end, being more hesitant. And, this is really kind of, I think of the strange situation, Mary Ainsworth of, kind of, okay, we're in this new environment or this new person. How are we going to respond? And are we using, a secure base to kind of go and start to like explore out? Are we just going to, the moment we have an open space, we're just going and exploring beyond it, not really knowing what's going on? Or are we kind of hiding behind mom or dad and, not really, even taking those steps beyond that with, again, new situation, new place there. And I think something we see in our children all the time and working, each end has its own value and working to kind of have that assessment of our children and promoting adaptability in it.
Yeah, I think most people are probably familiar with that, the idea of the approach and withdrawal. That seems to be one that I think sticks with a lot of people. But we know these kids, there's some kids that come into my office that you would think that I've known them for years, So my label is I call those my welcomers or my greeters, right? Like they could be a hostess at a restaurant at 3 years of age. They're just really good at it. And then the other ones, I a lot of times we'll say that they're shy kids. I say that they're more of kind of watchers, right? Like they're kids that just need to get comfortable in that situation first. And again, I think this one has the greatest benefit to finding balance because, those kids that are really overly welcoming and, they don't have good stranger danger. And, there's a concern, I think, with that. And from a parenting standpoint, like you want your kids to be social. I think that's great, but we also need them to also have a little bit of kind of, I want to check this situation out. I want to make sure I'm really comfortable with it. So there's a balance, but we don't want to make them afraid. So it's trying to find that, so how do we teach kids that restraint to say, hey, that's great that you're friendly, but how do we need to get to know somebody first. So like, what do you tell parents in those situations?
And, at times I even like to bring in this concept of risk taking when we're talking about this topic. And so, risk taking in, opening up in conversations with others or how they're reacting to situations. And, for those that are overly like being able to kind of almost go through scenarios. And so like, hey, like if we're not going to maybe real world initially, hey, let me run through a scenario. What would you do? And just kind of like getting their initial perceptions or reactions, and that's for the children the age that can have like those kind of like general conversations. But I mean, we do this kind of constantly. And so maybe not necessarily in person, well, with people too, of like, hey, if you are in danger, and you're out in public, who are the people you go towards? We go towards the police officer, we go towards, the firefighter, like we go towards those individuals. And so kind of naming and specifying who are the individuals that we're deeming as safe, and then who are the individuals that we're not. And similarly, we kind of go through this preparation for that, that openness and almost maybe kind of like impulsivity, like, not stopping and assessing that risk taking. Hey, what do we do before we cross the road? We look both ways. And so, we do this constantly with our children to be able to kind of have them assess, assessing situations that they're in. And again, getting that initial reaction and working to have it, that kind of discernment.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's kind of similar to what I do with kids. I'll talk with parents about, we don't want to minimize their social engagement because it's such a great skill, but there are boundaries to it. And I think that's where that risk taking comes in, where it's, I just had a kid this week who he walked in, I shook mom and dad's hands and he gave me a hug. I'd never met him. That's something I think from a parenting standpoint, we go, listen, it's great that you want to be friendly, but maybe let's start by fist bumping people, or maybe, whatever it might be, like teaching that boundary, I think is important. I think on that other end, that kind of watcher kid, there's always, I think, a balance in, some kids are shy. Some kids, there is a little anxiety, but what are small steps we can take to help it? And, I don't agree with parents who push their kids out in front of people and like, oh, you have to say hi. But maybe starting with, hey, listen, let's work on just making eye contact with people, or, maybe just a small one-word response and building those skills. And some people, they're not going to be outwardly like that. That's just part of who they are. Again, we're not trying to take away them having some reservation. It's just in making it where it's functionally a little bit, where maybe they do, again, kind of greet somebody, but maybe they're not going to engage in a conversation for a while. But we don't want them over time for people to think maybe that they're rude or they don't have the right social skills. So trying to find that balance.
And, I can't help but think about our episode on selective mutism with Dr. Shippenblum. And great episode, but one of the things that she had shared in terms of like building buy-in and motivation is finding the things that the kids are interested in. I think she, gave an example of like, if there's a kid who really is into hockey and it's like, hey, you have to go up to will call and you have to get the ticket. Like, right. What are you doing? Like, are you going to miss out on the game because of this? And so working to kind of find that those motivators that connect and build motivation to want to engage and want to kind of take that, stepping outside of that comfort zone.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that episode up. I didn't even think about that when you said, I'm like, oh yeah, that's a perfect one for this kind of category, because I don't know what that research looks like, but I would say that probably if we look into the developmental psychopathology around something like selective mutism, this idea of, being able to basically our initial reaction, I think is probably something that's pretty prominent. I'm glad you brought it up. So let's talk about our next one, which is adaptability. So, this is basically how quickly and comfortably kids can adjust to change or to new experiences after their initial response. So, we have these kids who adapt quickly. My terms, the easy breezy kids, like you can throw curveballs at them and it just never bothers them. And And then there's other kids that need more time and really need kind of a slower pace to adjust. And I term them the steady pace kids. Like it's not that they won't adjust, but we just need to give them the right amount of time to get comfortable with that situation. So the technical terms are accommodating versus resistant. I never liked the word resistant because I find that that's really not what most kids are. But I think we need to give them the right supports and time to adjust. And that's where I think steady pace is maybe a little better.
And, I think this one is, it's the counterpart, I think, to that, initial reaction, where how we adapt with change. And, Ray was mentioning, this kind of sparked off some different research articles. And this was actually one of the traits named in one of the articles surrounding, predicting some of the psychopathology and, potentially surrounding, neurodivergencies such as autism spectrum disorder. And it even suggests, some of the mental health diagnosis such as OCD. And, if we're looking at it in the terms of the diagnosis, this is a piece of it. And certainly, it's not to say if we have our, resistant or, more so the steady pace children, it is, it does not mean that it's they for sure have a diagnosis. But, I think it's also something valuable that if we start to notice some of these patterns early on, it's something we can kind of be mindful of. And if we start to then, again, I'm going to pull back on another great episode with Russell Ramsey. Just using it's a kind of early screening tool for us that we can kind of just be mindful of and gathering information with.
Yeah, and I think again, kind of back to kind of our goal of talking about these things is, when we see this in kids at a young age, how do we respond? And so the adaptability piece, what we have to make sure we don't do is. And I think that's always a concern. Like when we have kids who maybe don't adapt easy to situations, as parents, it's much easier sometimes to just move around them versus supporting the child through that adaptability. So if we have a kid that needs that steady pace, it's maybe we're preparing them ahead of time, saying, these changes are going to come up, and we make a plan to kind of work through it with them. Or we give them more time to adapt to a situation. And that's okay. What we don't want, though, is that because the change is difficult, that we never introduce the lack of predictability. That I think this idea that the reality is new experiences hit us all the time. So how do we give kids the coping around that? The kids that are in that easy breezy or that kind of accommodating, there's not a whole lot we have to do, right? It's pretty simple, but not all kids are there. And so it's how do we build on that kind of steady pace, and how do we just give parents some resources? So, for me, it's, again, I always start out with, let's start by talking about transition times with kids. And maybe we give a lot of lead time and we work through them. And then over time, maybe we shorten that. Maybe we don't give them a full day to know that tomorrow something's going to happen. Maybe we tell them the night before, or maybe we tell them that morning, hey, this change is going to happen in our schedule. And if there is a reaction or it's difficult for them, working through that with them. I think one of the, books that I always find really useful is Ross Greene, who originally wrote the Explosive Child book, but his more recent book's called Raising Humans. And in Raising Humans, he talks a lot about how do we help kids around executive function problems, which adaptability tends to kind of fall in that, and it's, how do we collaborate with them to help them move forward through those situations? And I think that's really, with parents, what often I'll talk about is how do we support kids to work through it. Again, we don't want to avoid it. We don't want to make it because we'll never predict everything that's going to happen.
And, I think, we're talking about some of that, like the difficulty in developing the, that adaptable or accommodating response. But I also, like, when I'm talking with parents or, even probably more so like maybe like mid adolescence into teen years. I actually like to talk about, what happens if we're overly adaptable and the difficulty at times that we can have with speaking our mind or pushing back against various ideas because it feels like we're kind of going with the flow and like we're able to change and, accommodate so well. But in doing so, are we then not following through with things that feel important in terms of our values and things? And used to do this with a pencil, but I ended up breaking too many pencils, so I wouldn't. But like I would have like a clipboard or something, and I would say, okay, hey, like, if I have a pencil here and I'm, trying to get past this clipboard and I hit this wall, if I'm, overly rigid, I can press and eventually the pencil's going to break. I also had a rubber band. I'd say, hey, if I'm too flexible, it doesn't, it could, but it's not making it over the wall because it's drooping straight down. And I think that's almost that other end of when we become too flexible, we're not actually potentially making progress on specific goals. If it's, I'm changing. And so I try to encourage this idea of like rigid flexibility and saying, how do we maintain our shape and how do we maintain a direction or course, but we're able to then, kind of having some of that, like, okay, no, this is still important to me. I'm still going to attend to this, but I just have to attend to it in a different way. And so I think that's kind of like what that accommodating is really intended. But I have also seen the other extreme end of that, of over accommodating.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I'm not familiar with the research on it, but I think it would be interesting to kind of look at is, that those kids that are over accommodating, are they also kids that struggle with setting boundaries with people later on that, you do just, despite the fact maybe you want to do something, you don't because it doesn't bother me, but deep down, maybe you do. I don't know. I think that's an interesting point. I think we think of that kind of accommodating piece as a good trait, but you're right. I think in extremes, right, they all have the potential to have a difficulty. So yeah, I think that's interesting because maybe that there's more, sometimes it's okay to say no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always want to be like a people pleaser.
That's right. That's right.
And that brings us back and I guess kind of moving on to this next trait, being intensity. And actually, this is another one of those that the articles had mentioned. But, intensity is our emotional response to events, our range being from exuberant to lethargic. And, in this sense, we have with our children that are more exuberant, we see this really kind of diverse range of emotions or even kind of how they're presenting themselves. I think on the upper end, we have these children that have this like really kind of fluid and, kind of reaching that upper intensity of emotional responses. And maybe even how they manage their emotions. And so, it can be, something happens and then we're getting a really, really large response, or we're getting almost kind of a constantly like changing responses where on the like lower end of that, like that lethargic response, really kind of being a flat affect and, maybe a bit more, to kind of date the episode, I think Inside Out 2 is just, still kind of in the zeitgeist. And, ennui was one of the new emotions. I was like, that's a great, it's been a long time since I've heard that, but, even just kind of like that boredom where, where we're not really having an emotional range. Yeah. Yeah.
I always describe this as kind of that energy level in response that we have. So, like those exuberant kids, I kind of call them the hurricane kids. So they're the kids that, when they're excited, man, are they excited? And when they're angry, man, are they angry? They emote in big ways. Like that's, and there's great parts of that, but that's also, it can create some difficulty. And I see the other end of that. I say they're more gentle breeze. So it's a much more subdued. They still have many times a reaction, but they're kids that, maybe, their excitement, you kind of go, wow, like I really thought they would be more excited about it. It doesn't mean that they don't enjoy it. But they're not the kid going to do cartwheels over things. So those, I think those extremes, this is the one that for me really got me into this, like that really made me kind of interested in this idea of temperaments. And Mainly because, it just, gosh, in the last year or so, about a year ago, there was a study related to exuberance and ADHD. And I think actually a phenomenal study. And it basically showed that kids that have a high exuberant temperament also have higher risk factors related to developing ADHD. So we also see things like a lot of motor reactivity, fearlessness, those kinds of things that come along. But what was fascinating for me in the article is that they really talked about how parenting impacted the outcome. So that if we had kids that were exuberant, with changing our parenting style, we may delay the onset of ADHD symptoms or minimize the intensity of them. And we could spend a whole episode probably just on that study, but it really came around this idea of when we parent differently, we can build better executive functions. And so they talk about kind of three types of parenting. They talk about being a directive parent, a dismissive parent, and a supportive parent. And, we I think all want to say that we're supportive parents, right? That just sounds better.
Yeah.
But what the research actually found was that directive parenting actually had the best outcome for those kids, where, it wasn't just about supporting the emotions or behaviors. It was really about guiding kids in a direct manner. So I oftentimes use a simple example of, it's not enough to say, hey, go pick up your toys. Come on, I really want you to pick up your toys. I'm going to give you a reward if you pick up your toys. It was much more parenting where they said, all right, give me your hand. We're going to walk over and together we're going to pick up these toys, where it was a very direct style, a lot of modeling and those things. And that actually had the best outcomes. Now, not with all kids. So, I want to qualify so they did find that kids that had very high levels of exuberance and higher traits of ADHD, we saw less of an impact. But for a lot of kids, there was a benefit. So I thought it was just great research.
And, I think one of the, we've talked about various themes that crop up in our episodes, but, modeling and the value of modeling, I think has been a consistent one. And, especially when we have that opportunity to really demonstrate and show and be a part of the process, the value of taking it. And, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a lot of great research in that area. And, the next area that we're going to talk about also has some really a good body of research behind it. It's the idea of quality of mood. And so for quality of mood, it's this tendency toward a positive versus a negative outlook, and how that's reflected in kind of our mood, our behavior, and our reactions. So, even at a young age, we have some kids that show a more negative affect. So I use the term sunny and cloudy, right? There's this kind of, sometimes kids, no matter what, they might find the negative in things. The interesting part when we look at things like anxiety disorders, David Barlow, he looked at the idea of negative affectivity being a predictor of anxiety disorders. And that research has held true that when we see kids that have kind of that negative affect at a young age, they are more prone to it. Again, not a direct causality, but we see it more often. So, from a parenting standpoint, even at a young age, if we have children that kind of have that, focusing on trying to, even young kids can have negative thought patterns. So the CBT person in me is getting kids to try to find positives in situations and starting that at an early.
And, I think to just echo that, talking about that perspective taking and talking about like that. I like to, when I'm working with kids, and especially if there's like more of that negative affect, working to challenge and saying, okay, why why is this happening? And so if it's like, okay, parents are taking away something, it's like, oh, this is all, this is so frustrating, like that I don't get to do what I want to do. I hear that. And I want to validate and give you that recognition. But I also want to challenge you and say, well, why do you think they're doing that? And is there value? Are they doing it because they're awful people? Most of the clients I work with, no, they're doing it because they and it's working to at least kind of bringing in some of that recognition. And then, talking even back to our episode of disagreeing well, the idea of I don't have to necessarily agree to be able to understand. And I think even if we can cultivate that understanding of how a experience can be perceived differently, it works to build resilience. And I think, certainly for our kids that do struggle with negative affect, working to encourage resilience, or, later on, in anxiety treatment, I refer to it more as grit, really helps out in terms of how do we work to create a greater sense of ability to adapt. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, and I as from a parenting standpoint, especially with little kids, the example I oftentimes give, to parents is, one easy way that we'll oftentimes see this negative mood show up is tell kids to clean up their room or their toys. That's a good way to see that most of them, that have a negative affect are going to complain about having to do it. And I said, it's not necessarily this idea that we have to convince them that cleaning their room is fun, but our ability as a parent to adapt that to in a way that allows them to clean their room in a fun way. So, if your kids doesn't want to clean their room, maybe you let them pretend to be a race car and you time to see how fast they can do. It's a cognitive refocus that we're now going to take something they like and we're going to put that into a fun way that now cleaning up their room, isn't as negative. My kids were part of or at least my oldest daughter was part of the Barney days. And, when, not that I was not a great fan of the Barney show, to be honest, but, what did they do? They had a cleanup song, right? It was, and I won't sing it, but it's going through my head at the moment. Yep. Anybody that's heard it. They refocused kids to make it fun. It was a fun thing. Or again, maybe your kid's into Pokemon, and so maybe you take and hide a Pokemon somewhere, and you have a scavenger hunt that they have to do while they're cleaning up their room. We take a negative activity and we teach them that we can refocus negative to positive, and that's not therapy necessarily. It's just something that as parents we can do. Does that mean they're always that they're never going to, or they're going to eventually love to clean their room? Maybe not, but it buffers it a little bit. We keep bringing back some older episodes. We talked about, this idea of the gentle treat culture or little treats culture. As adults for ourselves, we tie
Absolutely.
something positive to something negative. We can start that with kids at a very young age. And the more that we can do that, I think that the way we broaden some of this affectivity.
And also a basketball hoop over a hamper really helps to turn, clothes on the floor into just a fun basketball, making various 3 points and layups. So yeah.
Yeah. There's so many ways you can do it. And again, it's just to help refocus.
Absolutely. Well, and speaking of focus, I think the next trait on the list is distractibility, which, I think is one of the traits that I think is a bit more widely known and recognized. And it's, our ability to focus and whether, we're attentive or inattentive or, even easily sidetracked. And so, those children that are able to attend to tasks, and I would even say those tasks that tend to be understimulating is a great measure. If it's something we enjoy doing, that still takes a relative focus. But, in the presence of different distractors or, things that make it more challenging. So, a noisy environment or just a lot of busy movement going on. And then, children who struggle with that getting sidetracked more frequently, noting when that attention shifts and, starts to wander or starts to get focused, on whatever it is that isn't that target goal or focus for them.
Yeah, it's, so my terms for parents, I talk about kids being explorers on one end and focused on the other. And, it's really, again, we keep talking about this idea of balance. The reason that with young kids, especially, that I don't like the word attentive is we too quickly assume that that means that they have something like, it's it becomes a criteria. And, when we're talking young kids, 2 or 3 year old kids, they're not going to focus for 20 minutes, and we have to, stay developmentally. So I tell parents, 2 or 3, if you attend for 3 to 5 minutes, that's actually really good. Sesame Street was brilliant. Their episodes are seconds sometimes, or not their episodes, but their segments are seconds at times. That's because that age group, that's what's going to happen. So it is okay that kids are explorers, that they're jumping activity to activity. But again, we want to get to a time where sometimes it's, kind of going back to what we started with is, how do we build their time to focus? And we're probably not going to get many kids that are 3 to 5 years of age that are much more over 5 minutes. Like, that's probably going to be a good part. Some will, but as a whole, if they're not, that's all right. I love going to kindergarten classes, and one is because they're brilliant teachers who can move and change tasks about every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And I don't have that skill. So when I see somebody do it well, I'm like, oh, this is really great. So, again, if 5 minutes is the max, our goal is not to get them to 20. Maybe it's another 30 seconds that they can sit to read a book or to build a puzzle or to do something that might not be high energy interest, but is something that will at least capture their attention.
And on the other end of that, like that, potential for distractibility, I know oftentimes that's, kind of viewed in that more negative light, but I can't help but think, even it's a model of, helping support emotional regulation for children with ADHD, but it's this really cool kind of emotional regulation map that works to kind of standardize how we're responding to this. And one of those is distract yourself. So, in the presence of intense emotions, the ability to distract away from whatever it is that's creating that, sometimes a really helpful thing. And so, and sometimes, there's, I think certain children, hard time letting that go. And, I think too much distractibility can lead to more anxiety, but, and many other things, but we need some distractibility to be able to let go of the anxiety.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, none of these things in and of themselves is negative. We all should have a range to do them. I think that's important. And, the next one's kind of on the same line, I guess, in the sense that the next trait is attention span and persistence. So, this is really that idea of how long a child can focus on a singular activity and what their presence is in face of an obstacle. So what do they do when it's difficult? So, can they stick with the task for a long time, even when it's frustrating? So I call them the marathon kids. And on the other end, kids that can only do things in short bursts, which are kind of the sprinters, So if we think about it, where they can be real intense for a good 2 or 3 minutes, but then they tucker out really, really fast. And when we throw in the idea that challenges also affect this. So, when we see kids with, of course, something like ADHD, those tasks that are mentally challenging are the harder ones for them to do. So, maybe reading a book or something like that. So again, kind of a similar strategy is that we're just trying to build that tolerance. We're just trying to say, hey, I want you to just do it for 10 more seconds, or, so, this is one that with parents, I say probably the best investment you can make is an old egg timer that ticks.
Have one in my office.
Yeah, have one in your office. Yeah, and set that, and let kids build the level at which they think they can pay attention. And as adults, now we oftentimes will hear about what's called the Pomodoro technique, which is, basically a similar thing. Like we're going to attend for 25 minutes and we're going to take a break for 5. And while I think some people think, I can only pay attention to 25 minutes, the reality is most of us only pay attention for about 20 to 25 minutes. So those little breaks we just may take in different ways.
Yeah. And again, I think such a valuable thing when we're talking about those children that can be, whether it's overly focused or like they really struggle to gain that investment, and going back and trying to create some of that, creating some of that motivation. And so bringing back that, little treats culture. And I think especially for our children that struggle with that attentiveness, being able to have something that feels motivating. And, again, this is more so focused on ADHD, but I remember hearing like there was 4 primary motivators for children with ADHD. And it's, interest, competition, pressure, and new and novel experiences. And, I think school and a lot of the times we're utilizing pressure. We think about that as like negative consequences or punishment, but also the value of rewards and things like that in generating motivation. And so when we need that resilience to be able to attend longer time, how do we then work to increase the motivation and desire to engage with it?
Yeah, I always forget about those 4 things I think are important. I mean, I oftentimes when I consult with teachers, I bring those up. So it's, I think from a parenting perspective about as well.
Absolutely. Well, and kind of brings us in here towards our last trait, which is our children's sensory threshold. And so that is how they are reacting or responding to just various sensory stimulus. So, texture, touch, brightness, how loud something is or volume, a specific taste or aroma. And, again, kind of having this range of like, children who are kind of unaffected, or they're able to tolerate a more diverse range, or children who kind of struggle with that. There's a bit more irritation, especially in the presence of, certain stimulus or certain sensory experiences. And, I think that this is one that when the term sensory comes up, neurodivergency, I think is a common, topic that approaches in terms of like whether it's, autism or ADHD, but really all individuals have this sensory.
Sure. Yeah. And, and I think, you said the word tolerance. I do think it is, there is a group of kids that are just tolerant to anything. It just doesn't bother them. And then the other side is that more reactive kind of a trait. And again, these are things that, they are oftentimes part of neurodiversity, but something I challenge people that even if it's a neurodiversity, it doesn't mean that we don't some exposure to it. Now, sometimes we have to accommodate. Like there are kids that I work with, and even adults that sounds can be difficult for them, and that at certain times they do have to wear things like headphones or something to help minimize it. But there's also a need to expose ourselves, and I think that we sometimes forget how important exposure therapies are. And I'd shared with Paul, I'd had someone in my office just recently where their parents accommodated, but also continually challenged. So things like food textures or the sound of somebody eating. As parents, they said, listen, we have to continually expose them because we want them to be able to be in situations where it doesn't bother them as much. Now, still, there are times that their preference is, I don't want to be around anybody else chewing. That's okay. It becomes then a choice that they can accommodate when they need to. But they also, when they choose to be in that situation, they've been exposed enough that they're able to at least be in that situation without it being so distressing to them. So it's really a balance. And for some, even with that exposure, it's difficult, and we have to recognize that. But in my career, I've seen so many individuals who have put themselves through their own kind of self-exposure with things and have had really good outcomes.
And exploring the ways of modulating. And, two things really come to mind. And it was a really early episode. And I think it was like swear words really matter. And you gave the example of, our ability to tolerate our hand in an ice bucket, and how if we had the ability to swear, it allowed us to, it improved our tolerance for that. Here recently, bit of a heat wave we've been experiencing here in South Central Pennsylvania. And, I've had many kids I'm working with, they're like, oh, I'm at camp and it's hot outside. And I was like, I get that. So what'd you do to make it fun? Or like, what was the most fun thing you did out there? And then they start to describe like, oh, well, we started playing this game, or we started like, and I was like, did it make it any less hot? Like, no, I just wasn't thinking about it as much. And so again, being able to encourage in the presence of 100-degree weather, how do we work to be able to tolerate that, and making sure we're taking breaks too,
right.
We don't want to overheat, but we need to go out in the 100-degree heat, even for a short duration, the ability to do so successfully.
Yeah. And and I think we forget how amazing our minds and bodies are. I'm a person who I'll be honest, I love air conditioning. It's a great thing, especially on these hot days. But, I just got back from some international travel and traveled in an area where, putting your air conditioning down to 72 degrees just isn't consistent in that area. And so, hotel rooms were generally set at temperatures about 77 degrees. My first night was tough. Like I sat there going, my gosh, how am I going to sleep for the next, week in temperatures that felt that warm? But what was amazing was, 2 days later, my body kind of adapted to it. I pushed myself through the exposure. I was uncomfortable until that point. And then my body forgot about it and I adapted. The interesting part, the whole flight home, I froze on the airplane because they had too much air conditioning. Yeah. I went like, oh my gosh, my body's now going the other direction. Now, it didn't take much to get back to wanting it to be really cold. But again, I think sometimes we overthink it, and sometimes our bodies will adjust over time. It might be uncomfortable. And yes, there are some situations where that adaptation's not easy and maybe never comes. But for a lot of people over time, that exposure will help. Again, exceptions to that, but at least trying to move the needle a little bit is a good thing.
And just real quick here at the end, one of the things I really like to talk about, or kind of adjacent to this topic, is homeostasis, and how do we try to return back to neutral? And oftentimes I try to relate that back even to mental health, and thinking about our emotions are letting us know what's going on, and we're trying to return back to neutral. But, why do we sweat? Our body is working to accommodate and adjust. Or another one is, I'd like to, you ever walked into bed or Bath and Body Works, and I was like, it smells really strong. You're in there 20, 25 minutes. The intensity of the smell hasn't changed. Just our awareness and it has changed. And so certainly, I think, we can adapt to really, really diverse settings. We just have to give our bodies the ability to get there. Yeah.
And sometimes it takes a lot of time to do it, and sometimes it's much faster, but it's worth us at least continuing to try to move in that.
So that was our last trait here. And really, when we're talking about temperament, again, and I think we've said it multiple times, but it's really kind of this idea of how do we work to find a harmony within, the environment and the circumstances we're in. And it's never about being on one end of the spectrum or the other, but rather how do we create an ability to tolerate variance and promoting success from where we're at in our general temperament. And then how do we expand that so that way we can, accommodate to be successful in a diverse range of environments.
I agree. And this was fun. It was kind of an interesting topic that I haven't had a chance to really, dive into until recently, and one maybe we'll continue to chat about.
Yeah, I hope so. But we hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks. But until then, be well, stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psych to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.